All right, thanks everyone for sending me your questions. For those of you that did, we'll go through this review fairly quickly so you guys have, something to go off of. But just, this exam is going to be fairly straightforward, not going to be asking really difficult questions. So first, let's start with question number one, which is the most difficult question on the study guide, and it's going to be the most difficult question on the exam. So, and this is probably the most involved question. There's a lot of stuff going on here. So, what are the side effects of trade restrictions like tariffs and import quotas? Specifically, what are the effect on price, the quantity traded, employment in that industry, and employment on other industries? So we have three figures below that basically shows what's happening in this market when we have tariffs and import duties. So let's first look at the market. The bottom left is the U.S. market for some good when the U.S. is in autarky, meaning that there's no trade going on with the outside world. In this case, the equilibrium price is going to be $2, and the equilibrium quantity is going to be 6 billion gallons of this good. And we have the producer and the consumer surplus labeled there. And again, when we have the supply and demand here, as the chart says, this is the U.S. supply and the U.S. demand. So we're only looking at the United States in this case. Now in the second panel, what we see here is when the United States opens up to trade with the rest of the world. Now in this example, the world price, the world equilibrium price is going to be $1. And it's going to be lower because in this case, other countries have a comparative advantage at producing these goods, so they can do so at a lower price. So if the price is $1, we're going to draw a line across there at $1 for that world price. Now the supply that American firms are going to bring to the market and sell to consumers is going to be where that $1 crosses the U.S. supply curve. In this case, it crosses the U.S. supply curve at 3 billion gallons. But the quantity demanded by consumers is going to be where that world price, so that $1, crosses the U.S. demand curve. So that's going to be all the way over at 9 billion gallons. Now the difference between the 9 billion gallons that consumers are purchasing and the 3 billion gallons that American firms are selling is going to be the total amount of imports. So in this case, the difference between 9 and 3 is going to be 6 billion gallons of imports. Now when we label these different areas, A, B, C, D, and E, Area B used to be producer surplus. Now that's going to be consumer surplus because consumers are getting this good at a much lower price. And now because we have trade going on where that world price crosses the demand curve below the equilibrium price, the triangles C and D, which in the past were nothing, are now going to be consumer surplus as well. So everything above the world price, all those trades that are taking place, are going to be captured by consumers as consumer surplus. And now the producer surplus for the United States producers is going to be reduced from B and E to just E because it's being sold at the lower price, at the lower world market price. But now in real life, we often don't dip down to the fully free trade. Typically, there's going to be tariffs placed on these goods. So let's say in this example, after opening up to trade with the rest of the world, the producers successfully lobby and they get a tariff placed on whatever this good is. And this tariff will be 50 cents per gallon. So what that does increases the price per unit sold by 50 cents. That'll take us up from $1 to $1.50. So we have that line across the $1 is going to move up to $1.50. That'll be the U.S. price. So the U.S. price is going to equal the world price plus the tariff. Now at this new price, we're going to do the same thing to figure out the quantity being sold. So the quantity being supplied by U.S. firms is going to be where this $1.50, this new higher price, crosses the U.S. supply curve. In this case, it'll increase from 3 billion gallons to 4.5 billion gallons. So now we have more U.S. firms being willing and able to supply this good at the new higher prices they're able to get from consumers. And for the number that, or the amount, the number of gallons that consumers are going to purchase, again, that's going to be where this new U.S. price, so the world price plus the tariff, is going to cross the U.S. demand curve. So it'll drop from 9 billion gallons to 7.5 billion gallons. Fewer consumers are going to purchase this good now that it's at a higher price. So what's going to happen to consumer surplus and producer surplus. So producer surplus, or the area A, which used to be consumer surplus, is now going to be the increase in producer surplus. So that's going to go to producers because they're now earning this higher price. So we're going to capture this away from consumers. Area C, which used to be part of producer surplus, or excuse me, consumer surplus, is now going to be deadweight loss from U.S. consumers having to purchase more expensive goods. Likewise, the triangle D is going to be deadweight loss from the transactions that are not taking place any longer. Because remember, we're dropping from 9 billion gallons sold to 7.5 billion gallons sold in the market. And the area T, that rectangle, is going to be the tariff. So that's going to be going to the United States government. It's going to be raised as taxes from the importation of these goods. So now the effect on the price of a tariff, as we can see here, is going to be an increase in the price. Because we're putting a tax on there, it's going to increase from $1 from the world equilibrium price to $1.50, the world equilibrium price plus the amount of the tariff. The quantity traded, again, is going to decrease in the United States. So in this case, we're going to drop from 9 billion gallons to 7.5 billion gallons because it's now relatively more expensive. So this new price, it's worth it to purchase for consumers. There's a fewer number of them. Employment in that industry is likely to go down after we begin trading with the world. But then after we place a tariff on it, it's likely to increase, or at the very least, decrease at a slower rate. So within that industry, they're likely to have their jobs being protected from this. While they are protected and typically it prevents them from decreasing as fast. So they're still decreasing, but they're decreasing at a slower rate. On the other hand, employment in other industries is going to suffer overall. It's not going to be by a lot, but remember from the slides we talked about towards the end of the chapter that there are typically spillovers into other industries. That ended up being more than the number of employees being saved in the industry being protected. So if we're talking about the example we used in the textbook was sugar. Because we have these quotas, these import quotas on sugar, we ends up costing more to purchase sugar in the United States than in other countries. So because of this, we're seeing it be more expensive to produce candy that uses sugar in the United States. So there's fewer people working in the sugar or the candy industry in the United States because of the more expensive sugar. And that was part of the impetus for the moving of companies like Hershey that took their some plants and moved them down to Mexico because Mexico didn't have the same level of import quotas on sugar. So it's cheaper to produce down there. So when I ask about the expenditure method of calculating GDP, what I'm looking for here is what are the 4 components that goes into calculating GDP using the expenditure method. So in this case, it's just consumption spending, investment spending, government spending, and the net exports. These are the 4 components that we broke down GDP by and we talked about a lot. So the next question is, why do we see measurement error when we're calculating GDP? Now this probably wasn't the best way to ask the question, so I apologize for the phrasing. But basically, what are the shortcomings of GDP? And why doesn't it measure all of the output in the economy in a year? The main 2 reasons we have the shortcoming of GDP is household production and the underground economy. So for household production, we don't attempt to estimate the value of goods and services that aren't being bought and sold in the market. So for instance, if you're at home and you're doing chores around the house, something you normally pay someone else to do, but if you do that yourself, that's not being counted in GDP, even though these are services being done. So doing things like cleaning the house, raising the family, taking care of a family member, when you're not charging someone for it, these aren't being a part of GDP, even though if someone else performed it, they would be considered part of GDP because you would have to pay them. The other thing GDP doesn't take into account is the underground economy, or the black market. So because these firms or individuals are offering goods and services illegally outside of government protection, it's not going to be counted in GDP because the government's not going to be able to find the information on those sales because they're trying to be hidden from the government. Some countries, um, underground economy can be as much as 50% of the GDP. The United States, they currently estimate it to be about 3%. So it's not a huge chunk of the economy that we're missing, but it is some of the economy. Then remember, there's a few other things. Shortcomings of GDP as a measure of well-being in general isn't so much measurement error, but things just to keep in mind that we don't include the value of leisure. So if you decide to work fewer hours, for instance, in like the late 1800s, we worked 20 more hours a week than we do today on average in the United States. That's not counted in GDP. So if people have more time to relax and spend time with their families or just enjoy the money that they've made, that's going to negatively count. That's going to count against the GDP. The next is GDP isn't adjusted for pollution or other negative effects of production. So we're counting the value created by these goods, but we're not counting the negative things caused by these goods. GDP isn't adjusted for changes in crime or other social problems. So if there's social problems, odds are the nation's gonna have to spend more money to try to solve those problems, and that's gonna increase GDP. So even though society is worse off, we're spending more on GDP. So if we were able to reduce crime, so we spent less money on police officers and things like that, that would count against GDP, even though society would be better off. And finally, GDP doesn't take into account the disparity in income between individuals within the country. So there's no count for income inequality. Right, so next let's turn to number 10. So using the following table below, calculate the real GDP for 2012 for a country that produces only these two goods, guns and butter. So in order to calculate the real GDP in 2012, we're going to use the base year prices, so the 2006 prices, multiplied by the quantity in 2012. So 2006 prices for guns was $10. In this economy, there were 60 guns that were sold. So we multiply 10 by 60 and we'll get 600. Then turning to butter, we'll use the 2006 price of $13 and multiply it by the 2012 quantity, so $65. You multiply those together, that's going to equal 845. So when we add the price times the quantity of guns and of butter for 2012, that'll equal 1,445. So that'll be the real GDP in this economy that only has these two goods. Note that the nominal GDP would be much higher. So if we're using 2012 prices in the 2012 quantity, the total GDP would end up being $3,140 if we multiplied the price times the quantity. But a lot of this increase in GDP, if we're just looking at nominal GDP, is going to be due to the increase in the price level. So we look at 2012 prices are a lot higher than the 2006 prices. So that's why we see this difference. And the basic idea I want you to take away from this problem is the fact that we need to use the base year prices if we're going to be comparing GDP across time. So number 13, why does some unemployment always exist in an economy? This is getting back to the idea of the natural rate of unemployment. So if we break down the unemployment rate into types of unemployment, we have cyclical unemployment, which results from changes in the business cycle. We have frictional unemployment, the time it takes for people to find jobs that actually meet their skills. And we have structural unemployment, unemployment that's caused from a mismatch in skills between people that are looking for jobs and the jobs that are available. So we can get rid of cyclical unemployment. We can get that down to zero. But we can't get rid of frictional unemployment and structural unemployment. So because of that, we always have some level of unemployment in the economy. There's always some workers that don't have the skills that are currently needed for the jobs that are open. And there's always workers that are leaving their jobs and looking for new jobs. And, there's that gap in between when you leave a job and when you get hired and start a new job. So remember, there's four biases that make the CPI inaccurate. The first is the substitution bias. So the CPI, when they construct that basket of goods that are used to construct the CPI, they don't account for, they assume that consumers are going to purchase the same goods every single month. But throughout the year, the basket of goods tends to change based on seasonal things and changes in prices throughout the year. Next is the increase in quality bias. Over time, pretty much all products in the CPI are going to improve in quality. So when there's increases in price, we don't know if that's an increase due to an improvement in quality or if it's because of the price level increasing. So it's difficult to pull out those, figure out how much of that is each. Next is the new product bias. So the CPI updated its basket of goods every 10 years in the past. Now we're doing it every couple years because of how many new products are being offered. So until we update the basket of goods, new products that are being created aren't being counted in the CPI for a long time. And then finally, the outlet bias. So a lot of consumers shop at places like Sam's Club or Costco or even go online. But the CPI doesn't include these sort of discount outlets in when they calculate the CPI. They only send them out to more traditional sellers. And most economists believe that these biases cause the CPI to overstate the true inflation rate. So that means the inflation rate ends up being higher than, the number of the CPI ends up being higher than the actual inflation rate that consumers are experiencing.